Imagine two people entering the same organization on the same day. The first is exceptional. He works harder than almost everyone around him. He solves problems nobody wants to touch. He stays late. He avoids office politics because he believes good work should speak for itself. When something goes wrong, people call him. When something succeeds, he assumes everyone knows who made it happen. The second person is competent, but not extraordinary. Yet she notices things the first person ignores. She notices who the CEO asks for advice before important meetings. She notices which manager controls information between departments. She remembers who gets invited into rooms where decisions are actually shaped, not merely announced. She understands which projects matter to powerful people, which relationships cross organizational boundaries, and which achievements need to be visible if they are going to matter. 5 years pass. The first employee is still indispensable. The second has become influential. And then something happens that feels deeply unfair. She is promoted above him. His immediate conclusion is obvious. Politics beat competence. Perhaps he's right, but there is another possibility. He understood his job. She understood the system. That distinction sits at the heart of power. We often imagine power as something possessed by presidents, billionaires, generals, dictators, and CEOs. But power appears wherever human beings depend on one another. It exists inside companies, families, friendships, institutions, and even conversations. These 5 books approach it from very different directions. One examines the recurring games through which individuals acquire and protect power. Another comes from the brutal political world of Renaissance Italy. A third treats conflict as a strategic system rather than a collection of battles. Another asks why leaders often behave in ways that appear irrational until we understand who keeps them in power. And the final book brings the discussion uncomfortably close to ordinary professional life. Together, they reveal something most people would rather not admit. Power doesn't always belong to the person who deserves it. It often belongs to the person who understands where it comes from. Robert Greene's The 48 Laws of Power is probably the most famous modern book built around that uncomfortable observation. People tend to react strongly to it. Some read it as a manual. Others read it as a warning. The second approach may actually be more useful. One of Greene's recurring themes is that human interactions are shaped by status, perception, dependence, reputation, timing, and self-interest far more than polite society likes to acknowledge. Consider a talented employee who publicly corrects his manager during an important meeting. He's right. Everyone in the room knows he's right. He walks away believing accuracy won, but something else may have happened. The manager experienced the correction not simply as information, but as a status event. The employee was solving an intellectual problem. The manager may have experienced a political one. That doesn't mean you should flatter incompetent people or conceal every disagreement. It means human beings rarely respond only to the literal content of an interaction. We also respond to what the interaction implies about us. Who looked competent? Who lost face? Who gained attention? Who became necessary? Who became threatening? This is why the 48 Laws of Power deserves more thoughtful reading than its reputation sometimes receives. Its value isn't that every law should be obeyed. Some principles are situational. Some can conflict with others, and treating every relationship as a contest would make you unbearable. Its greater value is defensive. It gives language to games that people often recognize only after losing them. But Greene raises a question he cannot answer alone. What happens when power moves beyond individuals and becomes political survival? For that, we have to travel backward roughly 5 centuries. Niccolò Machiavelli's The Prince is one of those books whose reputation is almost larger than the book itself. Machiavellian has become shorthand for ruthless manipulation. Yet The Prince becomes more interesting when read not simply as permission for cruelty, but as an examination of the distance between how power should work and how power often does work. Imagine a newly installed ruler. He wants to be loved, so he avoids unpopular decisions. He rewards everyone. He tolerates challenges because he wants to appear generous. He hesitates when decisive action might make him look harsh. His intentions may be admirable. But if those choices weaken the state, embolden rivals, and eventually produce disorder, were they good leadership? Machiavelli forces the reader into uncomfortable territory because he separates intention from consequence. A leader can possess beautiful intentions and produce disastrous results. Another can make harsh decisions and preserve stability. That doesn't automatically make harshness virtuous. It changes the question. Power cannot be understood only through morality of intention. It must also be examined through consequences, perception, institutions, and survival. This is why The Prince remains worth reading centuries later. You don't have to agree with Machiavelli to benefit from him. Sometimes the authors who disturb you most reveal assumptions you didn't know you had. But individual rulers still operate inside environments filled with rivals, alliances, and uncertainty. And once conflict begins, power becomes something else. It becomes strategic. The Black Book of Strategic War by PHON enters at this level. Its relevant contribution to this discussion is the shift from thinking about power as possession to thinking about power as position. Imagine two competitors. Company A has more money, more employees, and greater market share. Company B cannot defeat it directly, so B doesn't try. Instead, it identifies the larger company's dependencies. Perhaps the giant relies heavily on one distribution channel. Perhaps its size makes rapid adaptation difficult. Perhaps it serves everyone adequately, but nobody exceptionally. The weaker competitor concentrates where strength is least useful. Suddenly, the question isn't who has more power. It becomes, where does each side's power actually work? That's a strategic distinction. A large army in the wrong terrain can become weaker than a small army in the right position. A wealthy company can become vulnerable to a competitor willing to operate where margins are initially too small to attract it. A powerful executive can become surprisingly fragile if their influence depends on one patron who suddenly disappears. This is why strategic thinking changes the way we see power. Power is rarely absolute. It is relational. You are powerful relative to what? Under which conditions? For how long? Dependent on whom? Against which opponent? That is where this book earns its reading time. It pushes the discussion beyond visible strength toward leverage, positioning, timing, asymmetry, and the consequences of choosing the wrong battlefield. But there is still something missing. Because even strategically intelligent leaders sometimes make decisions that seem obviously terrible for their country, company, or institution. Why? Perhaps we've been asking the wrong question. Bruce Bueno de Mesquita and Alastair Smith's The Dictator's Handbook offers one of the most provocative answers. The book examines political survival through the people whose support leaders need to remain in power. Imagine a country with 100 million citizens. We naturally assume the leader's job is to serve those 100 million people. But suppose the leader's actual survival depends on the loyalty of a much smaller group of military commanders, party officials, wealthy supporters, or other essential insiders. Now, incentives change. From the perspective of the population, spending billions improving public services might be desirable. From the perspective of political survival, directing resources toward the smaller coalition keeping the leader in office may be more immediately important. Suddenly, behavior that looked irrational begins to make a disturbing kind of sense. The leader may not be optimizing for national prosperity. The leader may be optimizing for staying leader. And this insight doesn't stop at dictatorships. Consider a struggling corporation. Customers want better products. Employees want better conditions. Long-term shareholders want durable growth. But perhaps the executive's compensation depends heavily on a short-term metric. What behavior does the system reward? That's the question. Not, what should this person do? But, what must this person do to satisfy the people who determine whether they remain powerful? That's why the Dictator's Handbook can permanently change how you interpret institutions. When someone in power makes a decision that seems absurd, don't immediately assume stupidity. Ask, who needs to be satisfied for this person to survive? Follow that question far enough, and the decision may become much easier to understand. Which brings the discussion back from presidents and dictators to someone sitting 3 desks away from you. Jeffrey Pfeffer's Power. Why Some People Have It and Others Don't examines power in organizational life much more directly. And this may be the most uncomfortable book in the group for people who believe competence naturally produces influence. Remember the 2 employees from the beginning. One worked exceptionally hard. The other understood the organization. Pfeffer's argument challenges the comforting belief that performance alone determines professional outcomes. Organizations are social systems. Visibility matters, relationships matter, networks matter, reputation matters, access to resources matters, the ability to communicate accomplishment matters. This doesn't mean competence is irrelevant. It means competence that nobody powerful notices can have less organizational effect than we would like to believe. Imagine doing excellent work for 3 years while maintaining relationships only within your immediate team. Then compare that with someone whose work is equally good but who has built connections across departments, understands the organization's priorities, volunteers for visible projects, and develops relationships with people who control important resources. When promotion time arrives, management isn't necessarily comparing to identical candidates. One has created a broader network of evidence, familiarity, and support. That is why Pfeffer's book deserves attention, particularly from highly competent people who instinctively avoid anything resembling organizational politics. You don't need to become manipulative. But refusing to understand power doesn't remove power from the environment. It only removes you from understanding it. And now we can return to the employee from the beginning. He believed good work should speak for itself, but work doesn't speak. People speak. People interpret. People remember. People recommend. People allocate resources. People decide whose mistakes are forgiven and whose become defining. Once you see that, power begins to look different. Greene shows us that perception, status, and human psychology shape influence. Machiavelli separates political reality from comforting assumptions about how rulers ought to behave. The Black Book of Strategic War moves power into the territory of position, leverage, and asymmetry. The Dictator's Handbook asks us to follow the incentives of the coalition, keeping a leader in place. And Pfeffer shows how these dynamics appear much closer to home in careers, organizations, and professional relationships. Put them together, and power stops looking like a throne. It starts looking like a network. Who depends on whom? Who controls something scarce? Who can say no? Who has alternatives? Who controls information? Who shapes perception? Who survives if a particular relationship disappears? And perhaps most importantly, who needs whom more? This doesn't require becoming cynical. In fact, cynicism can be intellectually lazy. If you assume everyone is selfish and everything is manipulation, you stop seeing reality just as surely as someone who believes power doesn't exist. The better goal is clarity. Understand power without worshiping it. Recognize incentives without assuming every person is corrupt. Build influence without treating every friendship as a transaction. Learn the game without allowing the game to become your entire personality. If you want to understand interpersonal power and its recurring patterns, the 48 Laws of Power is difficult to ignore. If you want to confront the gap between political ideals and political survival, read The Prince slowly rather than relying on its reputation. If you're interested in power under conditions of conflict positioning, leverage, asymmetry, and strategic advantage, the Black Book of Strategic War takes the discussion there. If you want to understand why political leaders and institutions sometimes behave in ways that seem irrational, the Dictator's Handbook gives you an unusually powerful lens. And if your concern is much closer to your own career, Pfeffer's Power may be the book that makes you notice what has been happening around you all along. Because power isn't dangerous only when someone abuses it. Power can also be dangerous when you refuse to believe it exists. The person who understands only power eventually sees every relationship as a contest. But the person who understands nothing about power can spend years being surprised by decisions everyone else saw coming. Wisdom may sit somewhere between those extremes. See the system. Understand the incentives. Know where the leverage actually lies. Then decide what kind of person you want to be inside it.